11/9/2023, and this happens to be the anniversary, 29th anniversary of the Pagan Leadership Conferences of Chicago that I was involved with and hosted. Yes, that long ago. And as we face the 30th anniversary of the Parliament, is to remember this was one of the first events that I was personally responsible for to do so. And people, it's a historical in that we brought 55 leaders of Chicago together for a single day. And in that process of bringing them together for Chicago for that day on January 9th, 1994, it was a moment when everybody got to talk with each other and be with each other in a way that had not been done in a while. And it
Mhm.
would begin a series of events that would transform Chicago for at least a period of time. We're open to do so. If you'd like, you can always take a look at it. We've been putting up Facebook. We've been putting up pages on the Pagan World site, and it's been good. So hi, Don. So so
Hello.
I'm a resident of Chicago and have been forever. Um, and my family's been here and everything else. But you came to Chicago. Can you talk about your experiences with Chicago?
Well, I grew up in north central Illinois. Chicago was always kind of looming over my perception of the world, and I wanted to be there. And I found it really was pretty much, if not everything I expected, I found I enjoyed Chicago very much for many years.
Hmm. And you came out and you began your second career here.
Well,
Um,
yeah,
you had one downstate, but this was like a different one, big city stuff.
yeah.
You always talked about being surprised at how Chicago is very different than other communities.
I'm sure that I did.
Hmm.
In what respect are we referencing?
Well, you were talking about you were very involved with the pagan press,
Oh, yes, yes.
and you were involved with national paganism, but you hadn't really heard much about Chicago community.
Yeah, I always wondered why the Wheel of Hecate had no readers in Chicago, for example, and why, of all the people I knew and connected with, um, there was no one out of the Chicago community I was connected with in the decade before I actually came to Chicago. And I was dealing with people all over the place. I was a little
Mhm.
surprised by that. And what I found is that Chicago was very self referential. Um, it was a very self contained community in its way.
Now,
There were some exceptions, but they were
mhm.
not the majority.
And I just posted a piece about photographs we've been putting up of Chicago,
Yeah.
and you've been putting up photographs of the Pagan Leadership Conference,
Hmm.
Pagan Expo. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So in 1993, the Pagan Leadership Conferences where came out of what was the first actions out of the Parliament to kind of organize a presence for Chicago to develop itself along lines of interfaith. It
Yes.
really wasn't about organizing Chicago pagans, but organizing them towards interfaith operations.
Yes.
And that year we would host two more in March and then I think August or
Yeah.
September
In '94. Yeah.
in 94. And that would be the whole of the ones we would host directly.
Yeah. And then it became an organization, and that's a
Hmm.
whole other story. But as an event, it was great.
Right.
And if you go to the link that's provided in the chat room, you can see a lot of photos from that first Pagan Leadership Conference.
Hmm.
There are not an equal number of photos from any of the subsequent ones, but from that first one, there's quite a suite of photos. They're black and white, and boy, was it nostalgic to be posting them and thinking of all the people that we used to know
Hmm.
um, back in those days. And so many of them are in spirit now. Um, I mean,
Well,
Donna Cole Schultz and Victoria Carlson and Ted
mhm.
Chapman and Rex Hollingsworth. Lots of people who in my mind are still 30 years ago, but I know they're no longer on this plane.
Absolutely. And I guess I get that from people. I mean, that's kind of where the argument is.
Hmm.
And we're living in multiple screens. So let's talk about so in pagan leadership. So the '90s. Let's specifically talk about the '90s,
Hmm.
and because this is the time I think was very important because it was pre-internet or it's just the beginning of the internet.
Yeah, just the
Pagan
very
leadership,
beginning.
Tamara Sudaligan, as she was referred to at the time, Craig Schaefer, Eric Roberts. There were a lot of people who were involved. Were also involved in the early computer systems.
Yes.
And
And one of the things I noticed in putting up the photographs is that
mm,
Tamara was described as being from America Online with a hyphen in the program,
mhm.
um, which kind of tells you how long ago it was.
Yeah, and she was doing the pagan tea room
Hmm.
and chats online, and that was before basically the world, and that was the same year the worldwide Rebs.
Hmm.
Don Warner. And that they said this is when we still got information from books. Yeah, to a certain degree, but I would argue that the book revolution hadn't even really was just beginning.
Hmm.
At that first that first one, we were given nothing, but the second one we were given a whole bunch of books from Llewellyn and things like that. So we were still it was still a lot of group meetings, and in order to facilitate physical beginnings, um, we also did magazines, and Chicago became quite the magazine. There
Oh,
was
yes.
Avatar. There was our magazine, Pagan's Second Chicago Radio, followed by Roundtable.
Hmm.
That mutated into it. That we had also Avatar and Dawn magazine and
The
Circle of
Monthly
the Honorable,
Expectarian.
especially the month of Expectarian, the big boy.
Yeah.
There's even a picture of Guy Sparrow we have,
Yeah, there are several of him in the thing. He was leading one of the panels.
mm-hmm.
It,
And
uh,
we
it
were,
wa- and bookstores that are gone now. Light of the Moon, Arcanum Books. Um, I want to say there was another bookstore mentioned in the photos that is long gone.
yeah. Well, at that time, Chicago in the '90s had like 14 stores at one point.
Yes, it did.
And so this was like the really big burst, and the internet was starting to come in, but wouldn't become in a big way.
Hmm.
Um, we would start to do things, but we would in those couple of years we would use computers more for creating magazines. We were still
Yes.
very into physicality. Uh, and then you would move into we would be seeing things like there were a lot of public rituals,
Yes. Tremendous
movie.
number of public rituals.
There was Teresa Lynch, I believe,
Teresa
Moonbeam,
Lynch from Moonbeats.
and Matt,
Hmm.
who's still there with the Order of Phoenix.
Um, yeah. And at one
Um,
time, the Roundtable magazine, we used to have a listing of public temples, and I want to say that at its height, it was over 30 public temples listed in the magazine,
oh yeah.
which um, was a lot of public temples, but there they were.
Mm-hmm.
And there were several large conventions every year,
Mm-hmm.
um, including well at that time, including the initial pagan leadership conferences, including the later pagan expos, including the Fellowship of Isis convention.
Well, and most people don't realize is that the pagan pride movement was
Hmm.
predated by the pagan expo movement.
Hmm.
Um, and then pagan expo was 98, 99, 2000, I believe 2001.
Yeah,
I think there were three. It was either 3 or 4 years. I really
I
actually
believe it was 4.
right. 'Cause the last one was the Age of Aquarius, the dawning of Aquarius,
Hmm.
and what they were the same as pagan pride in the sense of the predating them. In the sense of that they were paid for by the merchants. The merchants got to show off their wares. They were free admission, and that we invited the press. Uh,
Hmm.
and we'll talk about the press in a minute. I think it's a very important distinction because there's a distinction now between then that's dramatically different, I believe. And that is the idea of that. And then we'd have the invite the press and merchants and classes and everything else. Very much. It was held at the Irish. All of them were held at the Irish American Center,
Yes, they were.
and which has now become a very pricey, very beautiful building that's out a little bit out of my price range right now. I was looking to do something there, and it's gotten a little bit out, but we were there when it was cheap, and we
Yeah,
took advantage of that.
they
Um,
were still rehabilitating it, I believe,
right,
piece by piece.
and then Crafty Crafters came out of that, and you saw Pagan Pride emerge out of that.
Hmm.
There was our Pagan Pride in DePaul University. There was one on the south side of Chicago, and that's one a lot of people refer to. The official movement always refers to the one on the far south side by Paulette Reynolds that she was hosting as one of the first ones. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of energy. Um, and the St. Louis Pagan Picnic started back then. You had that. You had a
Yeah,
lot of energy.
a lot
Um,
of things were going on.
so the 90s was like this popping. So we had this sort of physicality communication. And then for various reasons, they had Temple of the Lake, Lady of the Lakes
Yeah.
group, which was, I don't know if it was a part of Holy City Temple or, we kind of ran it somewhat separate for other people to join it. But it was
The
a very,
Temple of the Lake at one time was like a part of Holy City, and then later it was a temple in its own right.
hmm and that was doing public rituals outdoors. And all of this
Mostly at
came, mhm,
at Foster Avenue Beach on Lake Michigan.
yeah, Montrose Harbor, yeah.
Yeah,
Cricket Hill,
yeah,
and that sort of thing. And then there was a lot of other events that have now disappeared in Chicago. At the same time, there was also alternative events like the Peace and Music Fest that we would often attend.
hmm
Pagans found a lot of reasons to meet. Um,
yes.
the Occult Bookstore, which is now the Occult Society. And I think one of the things I don't think people realize is when the internet came rolling in, uh, we would leave Chicago about 2003. When the internet came rolling in, it kind of didn't help the city of Chicago. I don't think it was as big a help as it was for other communities. You had Witchfox, you had all the Chicago listings, but the magazines died away. A lot of the interactions died away. The magazines died away. A lot of the outdoor festivals. Moonbeats collapsed under its own weight.
hmm
It had wonderful going, but it eventually would collapse under its own weight. That would move over 500 people at one point at the height of it.
They were extraordinarily ambitious in the way they mounted their rituals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were like full scale theatrical programs
Sure,
in
and I'm so
terms of
sorry.
the amount of music and choreography.
It was gorgeous. It was
Yeah,
reason. There was a reason why people came.
yeah.
But we didn't have the structures in place. And so, yeah, so Chicago has got this one history. Now I've been doing recent things, and a lot of people aren't aware that all of this happened. There wasn't really good records kept.
hmm
I mean, we have probably some of the better records. If anyone has it, it's First Temple of Wicca under Stan Mosrick. They would have,
That's true. They may very well have quite
mhm.
a collection. They should, I would imagine.
And if you're looking on any of the Facebook pages or the YouTube, we just put up a link for pictures. And if you have pictures of Chicago, please share them with us. We really are trying to build a better historical record.
Hmm.
And as I've been announcing to the public right now, we're going to do more movies. But this is really why. Let's go ahead and take a little veer off Chicago and more into what we do, what have done, led, and our traditional has done so. Hello, Melanie. And that is the idea of photography, videography, audio, a lot of the early
Yeah.
radio. We'll talk about that a bit. But can you explain why? And people make jokes. I remember one person, Phyllis Crott was once in the crowd and asked if anyone was photographing. And one of the people says, "Oh, the Corellians are here." And she meant it tongue in cheek and happy. But the Corellian tradition has really taken on, you've taken on this sort of ideology and spread it in your culture that if you don't have a picture, it's not really there. Can you explain why that you came to that formulation?
Oh, I've had an interesting relationship with pictures during my life. My father was someone who photographed constantly. And as a result, I really was not a person who took a lot of photos.
Hmm.
I thought of it as intrusive and problematic, and so I didn't really do it. And then I got to Chicago, and I found that for a lot of people, the joke "photos or it didn't happen" was exactly how they actually thought. And
Hmm.
people doubted things I had done because there weren't a ton of photos of them. And I decided I'd better start photographing everything. And that is really a big part of why I started making such a point of photographing. That, and also to help people feel involved, but also to establish the record. I've talked about being in Washington, D.C. when the Helms Bill was defeated. But there's certainly no photo of that. But I kind of wish now that I had one. A lot of other things I did, but from the '90s on, there are photos, and and it's all very well documented. And again, it has two reasons. One is for the future to say, yes, this did happen. It's not arguable. I was talking in the chat room earlier about the Lawrence Museum, which I mean, there are people who think the museum was a fiction because it doesn't have a high profile in terms of its presence in photos and so forth. It absolutely was not a fiction. Um, but a lot of people do claim things did happen that did not. So I understand the desire for the photos, and that's part of the reason that I've made it such a thing. And the other is that in the immediate present, it also helps people feel involved who cannot physically be there. Um, when you post photos of your rituals, when you post photos of events you've attended, other people can vicariously take part. And I think that, well, I've been told by many people that is important to them, that it does help people who are geographically isolated, for example, who have a solitary practice, for example, to feel like they are part of that wider community. So for both of those reasons, I think it's really important. And yeah, Corellians do have the reputation of taking the photos
And videos.
and videos, whenever possible, video.
And that has led to what's the idea of this sort of part of your ministry, our ministry, I should say, but part of
Yeah.
our ministry, not only is other people, is the idea of filming rituals, of filming classes, of
Hmm.
that. In fact, that has been a very strong part of it, and that came out of Chicago. People don't realize witch school started in a kitchen in Chicago. Me, Don, and one of our partners.
Yeah.
Um, a couple of our partners worked. We worked out of the kitchen,
Hmm. The
and
computer was in the China hutch.
yeah, 486 Intel 486,
Yeah.
and we had to use a modem and everything to build witch school, and that came out of Chicago, being based on, I think, Chicago sensibilities. I think people don't realize Chicago was very Chicago centric in the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, because we were serving our local with that, but overnight it grew into today where it's got ordained ministers in 53 countries, over, have
Hmm.
affected up to 300,000 lives. We have all sorts of different things, but we've stayed focused on this idea, and it came out of Chicago and this history of Chicago that we were so established. By '98, we were online seriously.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Um,
Well, and on that subject of documenting, the fact that the reason we can be doing this program talking about the photos from the 1994 Pagan Leadership Conference is we took photos
I hired a
and
professional
we kept them.
photographer.
Yeah. Who
Hmm.
had been one of the photographers at the Parliament, if I recall correctly.
That's correct.
And that's how you knew her.
Hmm.
Um, and she did good work.
Yeah.
Um, so many things. Well, it's like the Temple of Fairywood. I used to work with the Temple of Fairywood in Elgin a great deal. And I would go into Chicago and people didn't have any idea what it was, even though it had been there for a long, long time.
Hmm.
But for all that they did, I don't know that there's much record that they ever existed because they weren't as big into the photographs and so forth. I think we really need to be mindful not only of helping people to feel connected now, but of what comes after. And will people know what happened? I remember Victoria Carlson, who was one of the leading high priestesses in Chicago in the 90s, telling me that there had been someone in the 80s who was constantly taking photos of all of the priesthood and their regalia and the different events and so forth, and then they were gone. They presumably died, or they moved, or something, and there were none of those photos left anywhere to be seen. Um, and that made an impression. I mean, it's a thing. And because we have them online, it's not quite so easy for them to disappear. But history is a fragile thing. And if you look at the history of our community, it's particularly fragile. And very often, one generation doesn't know even that there was a previous generation. They often think that they're the very first
Well,
bud on
Chicago.
the tree.
So Chicago's suffering from that from right now. In a lot of the interviews and people I've talked to, they're like, "Oh, we began in 2000." So we, after some of these events happened and collapsed, there's a whole nother group of people who started in the mid 2000s that make up the bulk of the community right now.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those people have now left in you because we don't. So if you have a history of Chicago, if you have old photographs, old writings, old pictures, please go to our group and share them, as we are trying to compile this sort of beautiful visual history of Chicago. If you have videos, if you can't put your photographs because they're physical photographs, talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
We can make arrangements to have them properly scanned and returned to you, or you can donate them to us, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have family and friends that are doing it, don't let them fade. I mean, that which we have this statement, that which we remembered lives. Well, if they're not remembered, what's that?
Photos.
Oh yeah.
Renee Bauta at the Fellowship of Isis conference.
Are these ones you haven't put up yet?
These are going up tonight, actually.
Okay.
I mean, not this whole stack, but a number of them.
Mm-hmm.
The Fellowship of Isis High Clergy from one of the conferences,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll see myself, Lady Amber Dawn, Olivia Robertson, Casey Conder, Laura Jane's daughter, and Carol Nolan, all on the high dais.
And Carol Nolan was from South Africa.
Yeah. I wish I could tell you exactly what year this was, but I'm thinking, I don't know. It was right around, it was around 1999 or 2000.
No, it had to be 2002.
2002?
It had to be 2002.
Okay.
Because
we went. Could very well have been.
Because Carol came over the year after we went there.
Sharon Burney Kozlowskis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably not pronouncing their last name correctly, but
yeah.
I never called them by it. I just knew them as Sharon Burney. High clergy again from the FOI. Wow. And you'll notice the shamrock above us, which is
the Irish American Center.
Yeah, that's how you can tell it was at the Irish American Center. And so many Witches Ball broom riding contest from the new Witches Balls. Somewhere in here.
Oh, right. So this is one of those questions. Somebody said Loopy After Dark. This at the moment is live.
Archpriestess Dina Buta.
But the next time you see it, it'll be taped. That's one of the big values of this historical record. We have this wonderful ability to be able to promote and to do this now.
Yeah. Victoria Carlson.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there are all kinds of things in here.
And there are other archivists in Chicago. I know of at least one person who has probably fantastic records if they ever wanted to share them. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of records that are available. So if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, we're talking about Chicago because that's our experience.
Hmm.
But I bet you it's true of every one of your cities. And somebody should try to, if you really want to do something like amazing, you should try to build your history and accumulate it so it doesn't disappear. And if you do, you can post them on Pagan Worlds according to the city that you're involved with, and that we are going to be excited about doing.
Donna Cole Schultz,
Hmm.
all kinds of people.
And these were important part of the history of the now, and they actually formed a lot of the culture that around there.
Hmm.
And so, if we so start photographing when you want to, and start recording because we're probably going to be the most photographed generation so far in history. Because we went from, and a lot of this stuff was done on film. Film was expensive, and that now we're using a lot more digital history. This will be recorded on digital tape. This is all pixels.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so this history is valuable for two reasons. The one reason is so that we can share the stories that have existed. Um, and the second reason is we keep saying that that which you remembered lives.
Hmm.
How much do you want to have people live? How much do you want to have a living story? And that's important too.
It is.
In our tradition, ancestor worship is very important. And who are the ancestors? Well, we're the ancestors of the next generation or two.
That's very true.
And so, while we're telling you this now, we really are trying to tell you to go ahead and start saving your pictures. So, let's talk about one more thing that happened. We had magazines out of Chicago. It was something people don't realize. And the beginnings of the Pagan Expo ideology came out of Chicago and then throughout the Midwest.
Hmm.
We saw the beginnings of those early events that would have led to, I think, one of the most successful events in the pagan world, which is Pagan Pride. That's why we've always been, people have always, why have we always been really involved with Pagan Pride? We feel very kindred to it.
Hmm.
Now we're not in the official records, though. Brian did recently said, these guys, were there, but we're not in the official records, and no one has officially recognized it. That was going to need a historian. But if there are no records, there are no historians.
Well,
You
that's
know,
the
we-
thing. I mean,
however,
if we say that what is remembered lives, what is not remembered dies. And I mentioned earlier, I was talking about the Lawrence Museum in my chat room earlier tonight. And one of the things that the museum had were the relics of the Voodoo Queen of Kokomo. And as far as I know, at this point, there's no more record of this person because the museum is gone now. Those relics were broken up. And I don't know where you would go to find out that there was such a person as the Voodoo Queen of Kokomo, Indiana. Um, there may be places, but I don't know where it would be. A lot of people who were not the star celebrities of the metaphysical world um, don't have a lot preserving their memories, if anything. But that doesn't mean they weren't there. And because we don't preserve that memory so often, we have a very skewed view of that era. We only see the ones who were publishing things, the ones who do show up in surviving photos. And sometimes it's so and so and unidentified. But those unidentified people were also people, and they were also doing things, but we don't know now who they were.
now we always talk about podcasting, and we were big into podcasting. But Llewellyn was one of the people right up, is that we were some of the biggest pioneers. Um, Let me be very clear. Selena Fox was one of the first ones to have a cable show in the 70s.
Hmm.
And there were a few other people who had cable shows. And a lot of people were doing being on the radio. But Chicago had Psychic Chicago Radio, the first wholly owned and operated radio show. We bought time.
Yes, indeed.
Um, Don't have a clue, Loopy After Dark. I don't even know what you're talking about. You know my area; it's both great and shitty at times. I do not know. So apologize, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. I'm more than happy to, but it doesn't fill me with anything. But we did Pagans Tonight Radio. Um, our Psychic Chicago Radio for years. It was for years we did that, and we've lost a lot of tapes. We have a few of the tapes. We
Mhm.
lost a lot of them because
Yeah.
we're on tape, and I'm always did that. Telepathic radio came later, in '99. Then IRC radio, yes, people who internet relay chat, and they started doing that. And then would be years. Would be after that we would get back into it. We'd do video first, but Chicago was like this origin of where people started doing terrestrial radio, and
Mhm.
then Chicago became the first really heavy podcasting city. We are the only ones, and I think to this day we're still the only ones who had a 7 day a week talk radio show. Now there are a couple of stations that end up being mostly music,
Mhm.
which is terrific too. I think that's great. There's International Pagan Radio, which does a lot of music. There's others that came out in the wake. Um, so that's terrific.
Mhm.
And so but Chicago is also the origin of being the active player in this, and to this day we have archives of it. So Chicago has this history of being nationally influential,
Mhm.
important. Patricia Moynihan, I believe Selena Fox came out of this area. A lot of people come
Mhm.
out of this area, and then they depart for national or other things. So it is very interesting. So there's a lot more to our surface of our city and Chicago and the radio. But there was one other thing about the '90s, and I think if people go look, and they will eventually look. I got very good at it. Is that the press? Who
Yes.
cares if you're in the Sun Times anymore? Who cares
Mhm.
about the Chicago Tribune? Who cares if you're in the mainstream press? Occasionally, you might see us on CNN radio or CNN, but the current pagan community it doesn't really care too much about being in the press. But back then, that was an obsession.
Yes. And the position of the press was very different then.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very big thing.
It was huge.
Mhm.
We got more. I'm one of the very few people. I will be very proud of it that I've been interviewed on all 6 continents across
Mhm.
every almost, and maybe not now, but almost every form. And I think literally every form of medium that started from '91.
Mhm.
I've been in podcast, radio, television. I've done all of it for interviews, and we pursued it. We used to send out press releases
Yes, indeed.
because that was important, and you paid for that. We sent over 50 press releases, and to this day, during that period of time, one of my most successful press releases is still quoted today, and I often use it talking about how we influence culture. Have you ever heard the term that we're the fastest growing religion in America? It's not true. I don't care what anyone says. It's literally not true. But when I wrote the press release to get attention about it, pagans and Christians agree, we're going to become the third
Mhm.
largest religion, and we are growing fantastically well. It was built out of cotton candy facts to prove a point, and that as a percentage, we were growing fast. But at the time, Muslims were growing faster than we were in America, and so were the evangelical Christians. And to this day,
Mhm.
the fastest growing religion in America is evangelical Christianity. Now, it's doing it by devouring other Christian groups for the biggest part. And the second one is spiritual, but not religious. But at the time, this article of us being the fastest growing religion got into the nomenclature, into the memes, and there you go. And it got
Mhm.
into it. To this day, we keep quoting it when it's absolutely not a true story. It's not true. I don't care what anyone says.
Well, by percentage.
It's not even by percentage anymore, I would betcha.
Mhm.
We're growing, and we're growing fantastically fast. We're going to double in size in the next year. I fully suspect it just because we're starting to get that.
Mhm.
But it was believed and quoted because everybody wanted it. And Chicago showed that energy.
Mhm.
Um, So there you go. So if you are interested in Chicago history, please put up your photographs. Join us. We will be putting up more of it as part of our Pagan World projects as we kind of cover cities and everything else. If you want to talk about the history of your city, talk to us. Write us at paganworldtv at gmail.com or go to Pagan World or DM us, and we will help you kind of present what you want about your city. I think that is very good. And so I think that's important. Any
Yes,
other
absolutely.
any other thoughts? I mean, I think it was all pretty important stuff. And now that
Oh,
we're
yeah.
returning to the parliament this year, oh my God! In fact, in 6 months and 28 days, yeah, we're going to be there. Yeah, we're already there. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yeah.
Um, and that, yeah, I think it'll be important because our history is there, and so it is important there. And so history is important.
Well,
And
history is important, and one of the things that I have noticed over the years, which I think is one of the important reasons for having these good records, is that we've often seen people repeat the same mistake, partly because they don't realize it's already been done, and therefore have not learned the lessons of the experience. Um, it I mean, we've seen people walk into exactly the same situation that didn't work before without making any changes and thinking they're doing it for the first time. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's important to remember the legacy of all these different groups that were once there, of all these different events, so you can see what they did right and do that again, and see what was not so successful and avoid that.
okay, so there's one last question. Ley lines, are there any running through Chicago? Actually, Chicago is an occult city. It's built very occult right from the earliest days. And yeah, the way the city was actually designed had ley lines and energy lines. And in fact, for the Caroline tradition and for my own practices, is that it is the heartbeat. We actually have the original crystals, the first crystals laid down of the great crystal web that is now all over the world.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of crystals laid out all over the city. I probably spent a small fortune on crystals, and people have given me crystals that we've laid out all over the city and have been laid out all over the world to do
Hmm.
so. So Chicago is at the center of a very powerful control grid, and it predates. So crystal grid since 8888.
Hmm.
It's been building, and we're going to celebrate that. And on top of that, a grid of Masons, Masonics, and other types of groups. The I Am Temple. People don't know. Did you know Chicago had the first Ouija board factory? And the gentleman who ran the factory one fell off a roof here in Chicago and died because of it. And then the Ouija board factory burned to the ground and was eventually transferred to Salem, Massachusetts, from Parker Brothers.
Yes.
But Chicago is where the original Ouija boards were made. A lot of spiritualism. Um, yeah, and so there we are. And as for how do we think of the next generation of incoming pagans, I love them. I adore them. I will talk about it. I will talk about them all day long. I think they're the greatest generation yet to emerge. I think they're doing a fantastic job. And I'm not talking about the millennials. I think the millennials were great, and they are great. And I think they're changing things in a major way. I think the Generation Z, which is now reaching physical maturity, um, are great. I think
Hmm.
they've got a lot to offer. I think they're going to be very different. We're doing this tonight because Generation Z is much more smart TV oriented, and they
Yes.
have a different set, and they love memes, and they learn differently, and they live in a world where there are so many books. There's a new book coming out every day, so we have given them a rich history and a rich books, and this is why history is important because they're going to develop their own community, and they're going to do it from if we're fortunate and we've done our job right, from a higher level of structure, a higher level of resources, a higher level of rights to protect, so they can fight even bigger fights and they can do better things, and that they are not going to be as alone on there. And so they're doing great, and I think that they are doing it their way, just like the millennials did it their way. And I was very fortunate to be involved with them, and I'm very lucky to have been able to teach them how the Xers. Oh my gosh, the Xers did it their own way. A lot of the '90s stuff was led by Xers, and the baby boomers did it their way. And each generation has been distinctly different. And and I don't think it, other than I think a lot of baby boomers are disdainful and a little bit older, the GIs are a little bit disdainful of the younger community, but I think that they're fantastic. I think they've done a
Hmm.
really great job. And they're writing, they're talking. I mean, they're creating publishing houses. They're taking their destiny in their own hands and not allowing it to be handled by outside. The one thing about the '90s, we had to go to big corporations to get our books published, to get our news out, to talk to the people. We had to go to Xerox and make copies, to make small magazines. We had to use all of these other types of resources. These new generations have great resources, and I want to give them more. Such we're talking about today about making sure that they know, at least have an opportunity to look at Chicago history, and not just the way that I want to tell it. I want them to be able to do it out there.
Hmm.
And so then, there's that way. And we have now multi generational pagans and Wiccans that are emerging. Not the old hereditaries, which we claimed out of, Gardner and all of that, but the new hereditaries who they can literally say, my grandfather was so and so, my father was so and so, my mother was so and so, my grandmother was so and so.
Yeah.
And they've been raised in the faith, something that you had and I did not.
Hmm. That's true.
So,
And it will make a huge difference.
all right. So go ahead, folks. Yeah, Lori Cabot is a great person to learn from. A lot of people did.
Yes,
Uh,
indeed.
During was mentioned she learned from there. There's where some of the Chicago pictures are. Come and join us. Come and discover us. Help us find out more of it. Um, there you go. I think there's a lot more we could say, but I think we've kind of made our original point. So
Yeah.
help us reconstruct the history of Chicago. Photographs, magazines, anything you've got. Either Xerox, scan them, bring them together, or talk to us about how we can help you with that. So as always, we end with a prayer, and we will leave that to you, Don.
Oh, very good. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, help us as we go forward to remember that which has come before us and to carry forward that which is good from it into the future and to heal that which was bad. Allow us to build our world to reflect the values we hold and the hopes that we hold dear. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, with great love and with respect, we thank you, so mote it be.
Tomorrow, and if you want to join us on here, let us know. We will talk to you. The Daily Spell and all the shows on Pagan World TV. So with that, good night, folks. Blessed be.